What will Donald Trump's MAGA supporters do if he loses the election?
Sarah, aren't we talking about Julian Assange?
Well,
Sarah, are you even a serious interviewer? Sarah, what the Australian people know that probably don't like your show very much, but they do understand the truth.
Marjorie Taylor Greene was never exactly a beacon of mental health, but her ever-increasing instability was on full display during a recent interview with an Australian reporter who triggered Greene into a total meltdown with perfectly reasonable questions. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video, and all of them come from Marjorie Taylor Greene's recent interview with ABC Australia and the reporter Sarah Ferguson. Now, again, this isn't MSNBC, it's not CNN. It is an Australian reporter who asked perfectly reasonable, calm questions. Now, the predicate of the interview was to discuss Julian Assange, who recently accepted a plea deal and will return to the United States. He's going to have to serve a prison sentence. And as the conversation developed, Sarah Ferguson used it as a launchpad. Say, listen, you talk about truth. This is why you say you support Julian Assange and wanted him to be pardoned and, charges dropped against him. Well, if you care so much about truth, let's talk about elections. Again, perfectly reasonable questions, as you'll see. And I want you to see how Marjorie Taylor Greene reacts.
But, were it not for the ability of Mr. Trump's lawyers to delay proceedings, he might have a string of convictions before the election related to January 6 and his attempts to overturn that election. Do you believe that he will ever face trial for those actions?
I think it's a real shame here in America today that we're seeing our justice systems used in campaigns and to sway presidential elections. And that's something that I would think people like yourself would condemn and speak out against.
So again, this is where she starts to get a little irritated. Trust me, it gets so much worse. But what's interesting about that is the justice system isn't being weaponized. And by the way, it was Marjorie Taylor Greene's own cult leader, Donald Trump, who campaigned explicitly in 2016, 2024, and yes, in 2020 as the sitting U.S. president about prosecuting his political opponents. Marjorie Taylor Greene not only didn't object, she actively cheered him on. She wished he had been more successful in going after now President Biden, former President Obama, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And as we've discussed in previous videos, the breakdown of cases by President Biden's own Department of Justice against Republicans and Democrats reveal that it's actually pretty even-handed. Based on one count that News Nation did, and we might cover this in a different video, President Biden's DOJ is targeting more elected Democrats than Republicans. They prosecuted President Biden's only living son, for God's sakes. So again, the argument is simply against Marjorie Taylor Greene. She has no facts on her side, but she's a cult member. Now, again, as these clips play, you'll see her becoming increasingly agitated. Let's take a look.
You've never accepted the results of the 2020 presidential election. Indeed, you've lionized people for the attack
Sarah,
on the
aren't we
Capitol.
talking about Julian Assange?
Well,
Sarah, are you even a serious interviewer? I thought we're talking about Julian Assange here today.
We are.
That's what you were asking me to come on your Australian news show. I don't usually do interviews like this because people like you can't be taken seriously.
Let me just put this to you, because you use the term truth as the reason why you have been so supportive of Julian Assange. So I want to go to one of the most dominant issues of truth in the American landscape. So, as I just said, you've lionized.
Coming from an Australian here, this is the dominant issue of truth. Okay, let's hear it, Sarah.
So you've lionized people imprisoned for their role in attacking the Capitol on January the 6th, including visiting them in prison. This is my question. What will Donald Trump's MAGA supporters do if he loses the election?
So what does this have to do with?
Okay, this is a damn good question that anyone who isn't totally in the pocket of the Republican Party should be asking Marjorie Taylor Greene, or quite frankly, any other elected Republican, because of course they try to deflect, they try to create false equivalence. This is something that I recently saw in a trigonometry podcast in which the hosts asked their guest, well, what happened? What will the progressive left do if Donald Trump wins the election? They're going to have a meltdown. And it's like, yes, people were very upset when Donald Trump won the 2016 election. There's no question. But in the 2020 election, when Trump lost, his supporters attempted an actual insurrection. They transgressed objectively far more, to a far greater extent. They tried to kill Vice President Mike Pence, members of Congress, and tried to install Donald Trump as an unelected dictator. It's just objectively infinitely worse than anything the left has done in terms of reacting to a Donald Trump victory. So this is indeed the question that reporters should be posing to every Republican, and essentially saying, listen, whatever concerns you may have about the left reacting to a Trump victory, they pale in comparison, based on the record, to how we should all be concerned about how the right will react if Trump loses.
Julian Assange again, Sarah. I think that was the purpose of our interview. Here, let me tell you something that you don't quite understand. In 2020, America watched riot day in and day out with BLM riots that caused over $2 billion in our communities and cities across the country. Sarah, what the Australian people know that probably don't like your show very much, but they do understand the truth, is that in America today, we have a two-tier justice system. And the Justice Department, the DOJ, targets their political enemies. And President Trump is the very top of that. And people that protested the election on January 6th are also the target of it. And what you probably don't tell your viewers is that many of these people that are being arrested and put in jail simply walked into the Capitol building through open doors and videoed and took pictures of the inside of the Capitol, and then they walked out through doors. And
so a couple of things to point out. Again, I notice how obviously she objected to the question because she's a snowflake. She got triggered. Then she invited the question. She says, okay, let's hear it. Then Sarah Ferguson asks the question, and Marjorie Taylor Greene has a meltdown, starts engaging in ad hominems and attacking. How dare you ask me this question? How dare you? You know, what about 2020? Well, in 2020, Donald Trump was president of the United States. It's a fact, okay? The BLM protests, the vast and overwhelming majority of them were peaceful. I know it's a meme, but it's a fact, okay? And I understand that that might make people uncomfortable, but facts don't care about your feelings. It was also the biggest mass social protest movement in American history. Tens upon tens upon tens of millions of people in all 50 states. It was not the central or centralized cohesive movement being directed by a sitting U.S. president. It wasn't Joe Biden. It wasn't Vice President Harris. It wasn't AOC. It wasn't Bernie Sanders puppeteering this stuff. What happened on January 6th, these were cult members of MAGA who were spurred on by Donald Trump's lies and directed by him to march on the Capitol. And then both as the cult leader and as the sitting president responsible for maintaining national security, Trump had a dual-pronged, a two-pronged obligation to stop the insurrection. And instead, as we know from the January 6th House Select Committee's report, he just watched it unfold for hours at a time. Okay, there is no equivalence of this. People who rioted during the George Floyd protests were prosecuted and arrested. President Biden condemned the riots when he was just then Joe Biden. There's no equivalence of this. There's none. But she wants to create one. I want to show you another clip here, the last clip I'll show you here at the very end, where she just loses her temper and she grabs the mic and wants to rip it off.
Americans, but of the whole world. So it's a natural point of curiosity. But I understand that we've reached the end of the questions that you want to answer. Thank you for talking to us about Julian Assange and for joining the program.
Thank you. Good night.
She mad. And she was mad. She's a snowflake. This is my problem with MAGA. You know, I wish we lived in a more civil time where we could have conversations in good faith with one another, litigating sincere disagreements. I know people love to clown on the West Wing, but the first 4 or 5 seasons of the West Wing, pretty good, right? But it's fiction. Unfortunately, today's Republican Party doesn't know how to behave in good faith. They don't know how to check their cultists. This is what happens. They like to bully and intimidate. They want to call liberals, progressives, women, minorities, marginalized groups, the LGBTQ community, everybody, people in blue cities, blue states, call everybody whatever name they want. They want to be able to insult and attack and engage in, vitriol and all these things. But they can't handle a fraction of it. Sarah Ferguson, again, that wasn't Chris Hayes. That wasn't Joe Scarborough. That wasn't Lawrence O'Donnell. It wasn't Mehdi Hassan. My God, she should thank her lucky stars for that. It's just a cable news equivalent. It was ABC Australia, right? That is about as anodyne as it gets. I mean, great questions from Sarah Ferguson, don't get me wrong, but that was like just stoic British style journalism. That's the kind of like generic, like sort of just like, hey, listen, I'm not impressed by you. I'm going to ask you these questions. They're important. I'm not going to crack up. I'm not going to mock you. Again, this isn't, it's not Lawrence O'Donnell. It's not somebody at the Rachel Maddow or anything like that. It's just a regular journalist who is not an opinion host or a columnist or a commentator. It was a journalist asking fair questions. And again, I think she framed it well. Listen, you say you supported Julian Assange because you say he told the truth. Well, if you're interested in the truth, what about these other things? And she asked the vast majority of the interview, the first part of the interview, was about asking questions of Julian Assange. So it wasn't like she ambushed Marjorie Taylor Greene or anything right out the gate. She built up to it. It was so methodical. Brilliant journalism from Sarah Ferguson. And Marjorie Taylor Greene couldn't handle a fraction of it. Last thing I want to point out, Marjorie Taylor Greene is so unhinged because the polls show that Trump and Biden are neck and neck, which, by the way, stresses me out. It is insane that Trump and Biden are neck and neck because for all of President Biden's faults, for all the good faith criticism you can levy at Biden. Again, look at Mehdi Hassan. Mehdi Hassan is an outspoken critic of the Biden administration and Joe Biden personally. And he refuses to insinuate that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are equally bad. I love that. That is the responsibility of a good faith critic of the Biden administration. And yet the polls show that they're neck and neck. That's clearly making Marjorie Taylor Greene uncomfortable, right? And so she and other Republicans are refusing to accept the results of the 2024 election. They're refusing to commit to accepting the results. Why? Because there's only one outcome that they will accept: Trump winning. Anything else is just inconceivable to them. And it must be, in their mind, because Democrats engaged in some sort of like skullduggery or nefarious activity. There is no universe in which these cultists will accept a good faith Democratic victory. And so you have multiple Republicans, Tim Scott, Ted Cruz, and and so many others suggesting, Marco Rubio, that they won't commit to accepting the results when explicitly asked about it. Super gross stuff. And by the way, I'll also point out, as we discussed in a previous video, the right-wing media ecosystem, particularly Fox News, Fox Propaganda Network, they are priming their millions of viewers to believe that the only way Joe Biden can win, the only way Democrats can win in November, is if they steal it. They have no evidence for their claim whatsoever. It's pure feelings. But this is exactly how we get the sort of thing like January 6th, is because of the dishonesty coming from the Republican Party and their media surrogates. Great stuff by Sarah Ferguson and ABC Australia. Love the fact that she triggered her so effortlessly, and exposing these loser MAGA Republican politicians for the snowflakes and liars that they are is great. Let me know what you think in the comments.